I would like us to move to the Irish Anti-Free Speech Bill, which I believe is called Criminal Justice Act 2023, but correct me if I'm wrong.
2022.
Oh, 2022. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that when I was reading bits from it, it seemed to me as if, they're portraying Ireland as a sort of society filled with hate. And I don't understand. This seems to me to be way over the top. And just I'll read from the first page from this bill. It says, this bill is supposed to be an amendment to the law relating to the prohibition of incitement to violence or hatred against a person or a group of persons on account of certain characteristics, referred to as protected characteristics, of the person or the group of persons, and to provide for an offense of condoning, denying, or grossly trivializing genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace, and etc. So there are many problems with this bill. And it seems to me that it's very extreme even for a hate speech bill, because most hate speech bills are focusing on the distribution of hateful content, which in itself can be understood as a really weird notion. But here we're not just focusing on the distribution. We are told that even the possession of hateful content or the preparation of hateful content is something that should be prosecuted. You have spoken a lot about it. Do you want to give me just your view on how important and how dangerous this bill is?
Yes, I'd like to clarify that this bill is actually an update of existing legislation from 1989 called the Incitement to Hatred Act.
Yeah.
And that act actually contains many of the problematic features of this current bill. So just to clarify, one of the features it includes is that inciting hateful feelings towards certain groups with your speech, is considered to be a crime. So that in itself is rather problematic already, because the idea that I am criminally responsible for the feelings of my listeners, for what feelings might arise in their hearts as they listen to my speech, just is patently absurd. The idea that you could possibly criminalize speech because it incites feelings, negative feelings in other people. I don't know where to start even with that, but let's just say that a public sphere that is vibrant must involve controversy. Citizens will obviously disagree, and they'll disagree strongly on controversial issues. And passions will rise. People will become, nervous and het up about issues. That's what happens when you have an open public sphere and when you have actual argument.
And so a dynamic society, I may add.
Yes, in a free and dynamic society, people will express themselves openly, and when they do so, they will say things that upset other people because we don't agree on. There's a lot of stuff we don't agree on. So the idea that, someone might interpret something that I say, take it the wrong way or be upset by it, and thereby form a hateful feeling towards one of these 10 or 8 or 10 protected groups, and therefore I could go to jail.
Yeah,
that to me is something out of 1984. It's something that's absolutely not.
It's totalitarian, basically, because no one can have any control over that, because there are infinite interpretations of any claim. So if we are talking about the possibility of reading and interpreting something as being hateful content, as meriting not speaking, then no one would speak. And this may already be to concede too much, because this is something that this is an argument that we could be putting forward even if we assume that there can be such a thing as hateful content, which, okay, of course, I think that in some cases there can be hatred and there can be such a thing as incitement to violence. There are problems with, as you say, incitements to hatred, but it seems to me that it's problematic even if we grant this assumption for the sake of debating. Because
yes, you mean the assumption, the assumption that there is hateful speech out there.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's deceitful speech, there's annoying speech, there's anger inciting speech, there's excited speech, there are all sorts of speech. There's lots of speech out there that's bad, that we don't like, that is harmful for society. But we don't shut down speech because we think it could upset people, or it could be politically incorrect, or that it could potentially be hateful. I mean, the real issue here is that it's not with the moral ideal of non-hateful speech. I mean, I share this ideal, that we should not be, pigeonholing people, expressing, ignorant prejudices towards people, putting them in these boxes and, denigrating them because they belong to this race or this religion or whatever. That's all lamentable that happens. But lots of lamentable things happen in society, but we don't make everything that's bad illegal. And there's a reason for that. And it's because there are certain kinds of offense that if you try to criminalize them, you will end up, let's say, making the law extremely ambiguous and very difficult to understand. Yeah. So the idea of a hateful speech, for example, there's a distinction in this law between incitement to hatred and reasonable contributions to public discourse.
Which is a very nebulous concept, because on its own, we could say, there is such a thing as reasonableness, there is such a thing as contribution to public discourse. But the question is, who judges what constitutes a reasonable contribution to public discourse? And I may say that the more time goes by, the less optimistic I am that bureaucrats entrusted with the power to make such judgments, that they can actually make them well. That may be a bit too pessimistic on my side, but on my behalf. But what do you think about this?
Well, it goes back to something you said earlier, that hate speech laws are highly paternalistic.
Yeah.
Because what they do is they set up a kind of thought police, which should be the state or the representatives of the state or the agencies of the state, including police officers who have to make judgments about whether to arrest somebody, prosecutors who have to make the same, the judgment about whether to prosecute. And really the issue here is that why would we assume that people, just because they're state officials, will have better judgments about what counts as hateful speech versus reasonable contributions to discourse?
Yeah.
Basically, people who are public officials are just like you and me. They're actually, often they're even worse than ordinary citizens. So, in terms of their motivations, they have a lot of access to power very often. And power, as the old adage goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. To have that power at your disposal, it starts to go to your head, and you can very easily start to kind of set yourself up as a kind of an expert, as a superman, as someone who can stand above the masses and look down on them and tell them how they should live their lives and instruct them on what kinds of discourse are acceptable and unacceptable. And I think people who approve hate speech laws and disinformation laws, I think that they are either they are politically calculating that the people who enforce those are on their side, so they'll help them out, which could be one possibility, right? The cynical interpretation. Or they're just hopelessly naive, and they think that people in power are philosopher kings who have this superior God's eye perspective on reality, and who can make much better decisions than ordinary people, and can sit up on moralistic high thrones and look down on the people and point out who has deviated from their social norms, which now, by the way, are no longer social norms, but legal norms.
Yeah.
Because really it's a codification of ideology, of a kind of moral ideology, about, appropriate and inappropriate types of speech and attitude. And it really intrudes into the internal sphere of thought and the private sphere of the home, because this particular bill, in fact, goes even further than other hate speech laws, because what it does is it criminalizes the mere possession of content that would be deemed likely to incite hatred in society. The mere possession. So police could get a warrant to come into your home, search your home, force you to give your password to open up all your electronic devices, seize your devices, and arrest you because you had a text sitting on your computer that they thought could incite, no, technically it's would likely incite hatred.
Yeah. Which it doesn't even have to be actual. It doesn't have to have incited violence. They say that it is likely to incite. And they say they don't even run the test.
No need to run the test. They preemptively shut it down.
And one question here, because this seems to me to be a very totalitarian aspect of this bill, because, of course, every time we talk about legislation is one thing. There is also the question of law enforcement. That is another thing. So the question is, if, let's say, people legislate something like that, how can they enforce such a law without actually getting the warrants that you just mentioned? So it seems to me to be a malicious way into pacifying the population into accepting such a thing, into accepting that it is something that, of course, the means for which practices like that are being enacted are good. The ends for, and this seems to me to be, what is the end? The end is protecting the subjective feelings of not everyone from the population, but from some protected groups. So for me, that would be wrong in both sides. I would not like a government to say that I want to respect the feelings of people, and they give they put forward an interpretation of what constitutes respect for the feeling of people. I would think that's a recipe for disaster. But here there's an extra step, because it's not. I think it's not just the people in general. It's some protected groups who possess protected characteristics. And I was reading it, for instance, it says here, some protected characteristics are race, color, nationality, religion, national or ethnic origin, descent, gender, sex characteristics, sexual orientation or disability. And in gender, it says, gender means the gender of a person or the gender which a person expresses as the person's preferred gender, or with which the person identifies and includes transgender and a gender other than those of male and female, etc. So it seems to me that this bill is just created to stop debating and stop brainstorming in civil society.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think you can imagine a number of scenarios in which somebody could be prosecuted. It's impossible to say in advance who will be prosecuted, because the categories are so nebulous. The category of hate speech, that it will depend on what the judge decides, right? And they're given whatever judge you get on. If it's Monday, it'll be Judge Samuel, and if it's Tuesday, it'll be Judge Freeman or whatever. And you'll have no idea what they're actually going to decide really in advance, because it'll depend on these very arbitrary, subjective judgment calls. But one could easily imagine a scenario in which, for example, supposing someone is writing an article that is very critical of transgender operations for children, right? And they make references to the trans movement as being irresponsible, for advocating those kinds of operations, or at least the parts of the trans movement that advocate that. And then, some people from the trans movement make a complaint to the public prosecutor, and they say that that somebody I shared my article with before publishing it, say I shared it with a colleague, and that colleague then brought it to the attention of the public prosecutor and said, I think he might publish this. In fact, it looks like he intends to publish this. I've read it. It looks very incendiary because it basically is very critical of the practice of transgender operations, or trans hormone therapy for children, and he suggests that trans people, or at least that some parts of the trans movement, are child abusers.
Yeah.
And he could say, this is going to attract hatred towards our community, because if the community thinks that some of us are abusing children, then it would be natural for them to feel hateful towards us, and they might generalize towards the whole community.
Yeah.
And he could make that kind of argument. Now, would a judge accept that argument and issue a warrant to search get access to my property and my computer? It's your guess as good as mine. Honestly, we don't know. I give the example also of myself. I'm Catholic. I should be one of the protected categories because religion is a protected category. So if somebody decided to go after Catholics and say that we're backward and we don't really deserve to be, in the public sphere, we should just go back to our rosaries or something.
Yeah.
I don't like that kind of speech, and I disagree profoundly with it. But I would not be comfortable with a society in which the state could prosecute that person and jail them because they criticize my way of life. If they can come after them, they can come after other people in society, and they could shut down speech, and it will become politicized eventually because it's so arbitrary and it's so subjective that it just invites ideological and political manipulation.
Yeah. So one last question about the bill. It seems to me that it's completely unpopular. How is it that we have come to this? I've heard something like 80 or 90% of the people are against it. Are these numbers accurate?
I'm not familiar with an opinion poll, an official opinion poll or recent poll that shows 80 or 90% against it. But I know that the submissions, I know there have been polls done in which there was quite a while ago, in which there was a majority against this legislation.
Yeah.
And I also know that the submissions from the public consultation, over 70% of the submissions were critical of the bill, were against the bill.
Okay.
So there's no public demand for this bill in terms of, say, a surge of popular demand for the bill. It's clearly coming out of the political establishment. It's coming out of the elite political circles. And, I think a lot of people speculate that probably this bill is driven by NGO activity and lobbying. That's the most likely explanation, because it just seems to come a little bit out of the blue without really any public demand for it, and against popular opinion. So this means that, as I said, there's probably people pulling levers behind closed doors, probably a lot of lobby activity going on.